Hey everybody, I am back tonight. It is still Saturday, December 27th, 10:30 now Central Time. So I made a post earlier. Feel free to go watch it. Totally bagging on 48 Laws of Power. Happy to keep bagging on it in another video if somebody wants me to. But it's been a while, and so it's going through my comments that I admittedly have not done in a while, and somebody left pretty good comment on one of my earlier videos, and the video was introverted intuition dealing with NI-polar types, ESTJs, ESFJs, and this is a video I made a while ago talking about, hey, if you're a if you're an NI user like an INFJ or maybe an INTJ and you're dealing with ESFJs and ESTJs who are NI polar, um, here are some sort of things you can sort of butt heads against, and sort of and interacting with them. And a lot of it is just because you're running around with your NI fully charged and they have no idea where you're coming from a lot of times. And so the viewer left a comment asking a lot of questions, and they're an INTP, and trust me, I could tell. If you write a comment that's like more than 2 paragraphs long, trust me, I know you're an INTP or maybe an ENTP. Um, but raising some interesting points, and then some things that I think I want to clarify, um, or hopefully I can clarify. And so let me back up. I didn't watch the video again, but I'm pretty sure the example that I gave is sort of the classic example that I I'll give a lot on this channel, but I do it I give it a lot in real life too when you're dealing with organizations, or more precisely management in organizations that just sort of refuse to change, and they even though the world is changing around them, or things clearly need to be changed, they stay the course. And a lot of times it's because you've got ESTJs or ESFJs running the place, and their default action is going to be, let's just do it the way we've always done it. Let's just roll up our sleeves, put our head down, and do it twice as hard, right? Let's just double down on what we've always done. We've been doing it for hundreds of years, 200 years, whatever, and it's always worked for us in the past. There's no reason to start changing things now. Um, and to their credit, they're usually right. you know, um, there is a reason that institutions tend to stick around once they've sort of gotten out of their seed phase and grown into a full-fledged institution. And that's because, they rely on the old tried and true way of doing things. And again, you know, 9 times out of 10, maybe that's the way to do it. Just stick with what's worked. But every once in a while, there's that 10% of times where the world really has changed, and maybe they need to change with it. And that's always a struggle, especially if you're a lead intuitive and you kind of see it, right? And you don't understand why they're not seeing what you're seeing. Um, and so it can cause a lot of conflict, right? Um, and not just in the work setting, that's sort of an extreme example, but just dealing with ESFJs, ESTJs in your daily life. You have to understand that they're seeing the world very differently than you are, in that respect. So, going to the comment, well, first of all, let me give the example that I gave, because I think the comment sort of relies on that knowledge. So, or knowing what that was. So the example that I always like to give is You've got this ancient civilization, and they are a agriculture farming society, and but they have this religion where they will sacrifice young virgins to the gods to make it rain, right? And one year they have a drought, and it hasn't been raining, and they're just like, well, we just have to sacrifice twice as many virgins, and pray twice as hard, and eventually it'll start raining, right? The whole idea of like, let's just double down on what we always do, roll up our sleeves, put our heads down, and just really, work at it. And eventually the gods will come around and make it rain. And so they keep doing that, and nothing's happening. And then you have all the NI types who are just like, well, why don't we just move, closer to the river, or where, the earth is better or whatever, and set up shop there. And of course, the ESTJs and ESFJs who are running the place don't want to listen to these NI types and their blasphemy, because this is the way we've always done it. We're just going to keep doing it this way. Okay, so you get the gist of the example here of competing against the SJ way of doing things. Of let's just do it the way we've always done it. Let's try not to rock the boat. It's always worked in the past. Let's just keep doing it. Versus the NI, who's just like, well, I don't know. It doesn't seem to be working, and there's all this other stuff going on, and maybe we need to reevaluate the situation. Okay, so the commenter asked, and I think it's a legitimate comment, but I think it's thinking about my example in a way that I didn't intend for it to be. So, or intend for it to be thought about. So the commenter is asking, well, isn't that the way that you're explaining NI, sort of this the lead intuitive who's just like, well, why don't we do this? Why don't we move, 2 miles down the road where the weather's better or whatever, where it is raining, and it'll be easier to grow stuff there. Isn't that more about NE and TE? And I think what they're getting at, and I might be putting words or thoughts into their head here, but I think the argument is, well, aren't you using NE to sort of figure out new possibilities, new ways of doing things, and then using TA as like, here's a plan, right? Here, we're in point A, we want to get to point Z, and here's a process of getting from point A to point Z, and we have to use NE to sort of figure out like, okay, what's a new way of doing it? What's a new plan? We've been using this old TE plan for hundreds of years. Can we use NE to think of a new TE plan? And I guess that could be one way of interpreting sort of the message, but it's not really what I intended. And, it wasn't really the point I was trying to make. I mean, I guess, yes, there's probably a little bit of TE and NE filtering in there, sure. Like I always say, none of these functions work in a complete vacuum. But the real point that I'm trying to make is the NI users are really asking, well, what's really going on here, right? Is the fact that it's not raining simply because the gods aren't listening to us, and we're not praying hard enough, and we're not sacrificing enough virgins? Or is there something deeper or more meaningful going on here? Is it just, there's a drought, and if we go a couple miles down the road, there's not a drought, and it really has nothing to do with all these sacrifice rituals and praying and to the gods or anything. It's really just the weather isn't cooperating or whatever, but 2 miles down the road it is. However they come up with that response, or that sort of um, reaction, it's not really about the planning. It's not the fact that they came up with a new way of doing something. What I'm trying to get at is that they're asking the question in the first place, right? They're asking, like, really doing the right thing here? Is this really the way it's, it, you is this really what we need to be doing? Are we thinking about it the right way? And the SJs, ESFJs, ESTJs who are NI-polar, they're just and again, this is a very cartoonish extreme example, and I don't mean to disparage our ESTJ, ESFJ friends, but I'm only embellishing for effect, just so you get the general concept, hopefully. And that's, they're very tied into the old way of doing things because they rely on introverted sensing, which is feeding their, TE or their FE, and they don't care about why we, they've been doing it for that way for so long. They just know that we've always done it that way, and that's the way it works. And who cares why, right? Because they're bipolar. They're and again, very extreme. It's not like they're completely lacking in I get it, but they don't care. They don't care why. They just know, like, this is the way we've always done it. And so if you take it into a less cartoonish example and a more real world example, where if and you see this at companies all the time, where they've been around, they've been very well established, they've always done things this way, they've been doing it that way for 50, 100, maybe 200 years. This is just the way we run our business. This is what we do. And again, 9 times out of 10, it's probably going to work because it's worked that long. But every once in a while, the world might change. You have AI or the internet or, something drastic happens and they have to sort of think about, okay, is the old way of doing things still the best way or the right way of doing it, right? And so they have to dig deeper. They have to start thinking about things in context. They have to start thinking of the meaning of why, of why they're doing what they're doing. And those people who are lead intuitives think about meaning all the time. Like, yeah, sure, you've done that for 100 years, but why were you doing it for 100 years? Maybe, I'm thinking of, like, some sort of business that relied on going through the yellow pages or something and, cold calling people in the yellow pages, and then the yellow pages become obsolete, but they still insist on going through the yellow pages because they've been doing it that way for forever. And you're just like, well, there's different ways of doing things now, so yeah, you did it that way for 100 years, but here's why you were doing it that way for 100 years, and now it no longer makes sense, right? So trying to find that underlying meaning. Okay. Um, so let me give you some real world examples that I was thinking of when I was reading these comments. Um, so I have a friend who I mention all the time who's an ESFJ, and like here's a classic example of ESFJ, where she had stayed at some hotel, some chain that I won't name, but we've all heard of it. But she like had an experience at one of these chains where she went in, she checked in, went to the room, and it was like dirty or something. Like she's a little OCD, a little bit of a germaphobe. So I don't know how bad it was, but it was bad enough to where she was just like, I can't stay here. I can't sleep here. And so she went downstairs and was just like, I want my money back and blah, blah, blah. And so she had a whole thing about getting her money back, which didn't help the situation. But you can probably guess where I'm going with this. So now she refuses to stay in any of those hotels. Um, even though this happened at one place, in one city, and it was probably a locally owned hotel, but still, she refuses to stay. Now granted, she had a hard time getting her money back and everything, and so part of it is principle, but still, in her mind, like she's just written that hotel off, right? It was dirty. That was her experience. It was dirty and gross, and I'm never staying at that type of hotel again. Um, and so from that one experience, she's now completely written off a whole chain of hotels, right? But if you asked her, like, okay, well, why was it dirty? That doesn't matter, right? In this context. But as a lead intuitive, if you are a lead intuitive, you would be thinking, okay, well, did they just, have really bad staff that day, or the staff didn't show up, or they like accidentally skipped the room and did it get clean completely? You're like, you're kind of asking why did that happen? Like, the just having one experience with it isn't enough, right? For an intuitive, it's like, okay, yeah, it was dirty, but why? And you could dig into it maybe a little and then find out that this particular chain is notorious for having dirty rooms because they have very low standards, or they have very, bad hiring practices or monitoring practices. And, everybody across the country complains about this particular hotel chain. Okay, well, now maybe there's something there. Maybe there's a reason not to stay at this hotel chain, because you have some meaning underlying it. You have some context, right? And it's not just based off of this one experience that you had. And the same would go for, you're lead intuitive, and you meet somebody and you just get this vibe from them. You're just like, yeah, I know this type of person, and yeah, that's just not somebody you really want to mess around with, or anybody you want to, spend a whole lot of, just not somebody you want to bother with. And the ESFJ, or my friend in this particular case, be like, "Oh no, I talked to so and so, and they were very nice, and I got along with them very well." And so says that they're very nice too, and you're just like, "No, just get this weird vibe from them." And again, you have this intuition in like sort of the traditional sense, right? But they are relying on their experience. Now, trust me, in a year or so, they will come around and be like, "Oh my God, you were totally right about that person," But they have to learn. They have to get, have some bad experience with them, or hear about it from somebody else. They're not going to rely just on your intuition, right? Your quote unquote pattern recognition, or and you can explain to them all you want, like, why you think that this person is bad news, or why you think that this particular hotel chain is fine. You just had a bad experience, but in general, it's fine. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it unless they actually have a different experience that changes their mind, is the point. Um, so hopefully that helps. There was a lot going on it was a pretty long comment, but I think that was a fundamental, I don't want to say misunderstanding, but just looking at my example in a way that I wasn't really intending for it. It wasn't the point of the example. Um, and yeah, and I would certainly agree that if they find some new way of doing something, that's going to be the NET, sure, but it wasn't the point that I was trying to make of the difficulty of being an NI dominant user interacting with ESFJs and ESTJs, because it's more about they're relying on particulars. They're relying on their experience. And you're relying more on, well, what does this all mean? What's the deeper meaning here? What's the context here? And one particular experience isn't really going to hold a lot of weight unless it was a really catastrophic experience, right? Okay. The other point or question that the viewer raised is this idea of pattern recognition between SI and NI, which I think is also a good question. And it's actually something that sort of coincidentally, I'd mentioned the TikTok channel Bubbles, Bubbles, Darling, something like that. Who's an INFJ and makes a bunch of INFJ related TikTok videos, who I invite you to check her out. She's very good. I like her channel and what she has to say. However, and one of the things, a few topics that she's touched on is pattern recognition in sensors and pattern recognition in intuitives, and how we always hear that, oh, intuition is about pattern recognition, and it is to a degree, but sensors can do pattern recognition too. They just do it in a different way. They're doing pattern recognition based off of experience, things that they've actually experienced with their senses, things that they've seen or heard. I would say sort of events, especially the SI types, versus pattern recognition in sort of the meaning contextual sense. And so the example that this commenter used, let me bring it up here again. You could say this is, I'm quoting here, I'm reading it. His I think it's a he comment here. We could say SI types plays out in the brain how things unfold based on collection of past experience. I'd say that it probably does in sort of high level intuitive way. That is, it's not merely a dumb chain of if else conditions. Instead, it's a complex web of heuristics that they are all based on real experience. He goes on to give an example. Okay, for example, every time you see a couple and the woman looks at her boyfriend in a certain way, they could tell that she despises him because they've seen that play out before and they expect it to play out in a similar way. So you've got a sensor who sees, a lady give her boyfriend or husband or whoever sort of this, evil eye look, and you sort of recognize that for what it is because you experienced it. You've seen other people give that kind of look, and you know what they mean by that, and develop that knowledge based off of your past experience, seeing it, other people do it. Sure, yeah. I mean, that would be pattern recognition for a sensor type. I've got zero problem saying that sensors engage in pattern recognition based off of sensory information and experience. And I would say the intuitive doesn't, I mean, they might pick up on that too, but their pattern recognition is a little different. So sort of expanding on this example, it's, they might pick up on, oh, that's a dirty look. And there could be just something deep and evolutionary that, you pick up on bad facial expressions that we all pick up on, whether we're sensors or intuitives. But going along with the example, what they would pick up on is less about those sort of sensory cues. And INFJs and INTJ, they've got extroverted sensing, so they're gonna pick up on some of that stuff too, but maybe not as much as a sensor might. But their pattern recognition is more about, yeah, those two types of people typically don't work out, you know. Um, or maybe something like, oh yeah, she gave him that evil eye, but that's because of X, Y. Like you kind of see the scenario play out in a way of why is she giving him that evil look? You know, did he say something inappropriate right before it? Or has there been tension all along between these two? Or, just looking the intuitives are looking more at the context, the meaning, like what's really going on here, and less about like, oh, I saw the evil look, and so that's that. That's it. Um, and they also might not be, they might not go for the head fake as much, right? Whereas sensor might see it and be like, oh, that's it, they're over. She gave him a bad look. Where the intuitives might just be like, well, that's just kind of her way of getting her way. Like she wants to leave, and that's just what she does when she wants to get her way, but she doesn't really mean anything by it. That kind of thing. Like, what's really going on here? What's the meaning underlying this kind of thing? So a different point being is sort of a different type of pattern recognition going on. But I do think, I mean, you can't say that sensors don't do pattern recognition, and I don't think that intuition is the only pattern recognition. I mean, your brain is constantly, hardwiring itself based off of repeated experiences, and so sure, sensors are going to see patterns, um, but intuitives see different types of patterns. They see, context and meaning. Underlying the pattern, or the pattern is the context and the meaning. It might be a better way of saying it. Where the sensor types or SI types, it might just be like, oh, here's just another example to put in my, my treasure trove of SI experiences that, you know, solidify my knowledge about, these two don't like each other, that kind of thing. Like so and so told me these two don't like each other, and now I see her giving him the evil eye, and so that's just more information for me to store away, in my SI knowledge. So, and I think it's important, again, going to the point of, these functions don't operate in a vacuum, because there's a lot in the comment about interaction with TI and what's TI doing and what's SI doing and NI doing. And I'll invite you to read the comment. But I think it's important to remember, sometimes we talk about the functions in a vacuum, like this is what NI does, this is what SI does, this is what TI does. And you have to be able to think about it that way. But you also have to sort of change gears in your head and think about dynamics between the functions and how they're interacting with each other. Because a lot of times it's very hard to say, something like, some circumscribed behavior is a TE behavior. And it's like figuring out how to get from your apartment to the grocery store, planning it out, well, if I just said generally getting from your apartment to the grocery store, yeah, there's TE, but there's also SE, right? You got to be able to see where you're going, right? There's going to be some FE parts to it, like why that grocery store and not the other grocery store. There's going to be some, I mean, there's obviously you got to figure out what lens on the microscope you're looking at it through, right? Um, what level of processing are we talking about? And that's one of the dangers, frankly, of describing cognitive functions in sort of these big behavioral sort of things. I mean, I do think that you should think of cognitive functions as doing something as a verb. I am paying attention to this type of information and processing it. Um, but if you start talking about complex behaviors, it's especially for the INTPs that would have parsed everything out and have very clear definitions for things. Yes, it's very easy for things to get blurry when you're talking about doing complex behavior because you need different systems all working together to figure it out for you. So when you're just like, is that a TI thing or a TI plus SI or that kind of thing? It really depends on the frame. Again, like which lens on the microscope are you using? How are you framing the example, right? Are we talking about a big complicated process that involves a lot of the cognitive functions? Are we talking about a very specific part of it? And so you have to be careful about that. And that's why it's important, I think, to categorize what process are you talking about a knowing function? Are you talking about a deliberation function? Like, TI versus FI? Are you talking about a interfacing function, TE or FE, or an interfacing process? So so I think that helps break it down in an analytical way a little bit better. So rather than sort of big picture things like coming up with a new idea, I don't know. Yeah, there's going to be some TI validation part of it. There's going to be maybe some NE brainstorming. Maybe there's going to be some NI filtering. Um, there's going to be a lot going on there. And so you need to be a little bit more specific, or just all of us need to be very specific when talking about this, about what type of processing is the person doing. Not just grand descriptions of complicated behaviors. I don't know. Hopefully that helps. Trying to think of an example of where that was relevant, but it was sort of an overlying theme. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of going into the TI plus NE thing of maybe you meant TE or NE. I don't know. Oh, okay. Where you're talking about, trying to figure out systems, and TE sort of works in isolation. And I thought that was a good observation or a good comment that TE is worried about, okay, I've got this particular plan, so I need to figure out this system. How do I get from A to B? And then you go on to say, I think that TI is looking at sort of the broader picture of, well, why did, that system, how does it link up with other systems that sort of operate in similar ways, and then yet bigger systems? And I honestly don't know if that's a TI thing. And I think that's where you and I might differ. I think that's more of an NI thing. When you start making analogies between concepts, I think you're doing more NI work. NI is tough because I think of NI as more passive than active. TI, I think, is very active. Like you're literally processing logical proofs. If P, then Q, not Q, then not P. You're running it through the algorithm. Where NI is a little more again, passive, a little bit more fluid. And I think of it as more of like you have this Excel spreadsheet in your head with all these facts and all these observations and information, knowledge, and it's this Excel sheet that's sort of this knowledge base. It's this database that you've got in your head. And especially when you're sleeping, but just throughout the day, but especially when you're sleeping, that database starts making connections between things that you didn't necessarily experience or see actually happen, but it's starting to figure out that there's correlations, right? Like every time I go to this store, this person happens to be there, and then you start thinking, okay, well, why were they there? And blah blah blah. And you're doing this like in your sleep or like when you're not paying attention. It's just sort of going on in the background. It's what they call consolidation in neuroscience or psychology. But the point being that things things that fire together wire together is the old saying in neuroscience. And so if you have a lot of things that tend to fire together or close in time, they start to wire together to sort of make bigger concepts. And that is not so much of an active process where you're deliberately trying to figure out the analogy, um, and more about it's just growing your database and it's growing links between concepts within your database, even if you're not actively doing it. Some people will argue that's what dreams are doing, is that they're creating these, links between concepts. Sure, it sounds like a good explanation to me. But whatever's happening, it's happening without a whole lot of activity. So the knowledge functions, yeah, there's some activity going on, active versus passive. But I think of it as sort of passively being built in the same way SI is sort of passively being built, where you're just absorbing the experience, you're observing it. I mean, this is why you can call them perception functions, because they're not doing anything, they're just sort of observing, right? And building up this knowledge base. I mean, he didn't talk about it in that way, but if he had thought about it long enough, he probably would have. But if he had lasted through the cognitive revolution, he would have totally ended up here. And so SI is sort of building up knowledge in this indirect, passive way. Yeah, you're actively interacting with the world and building those experiences, but the SI is just sort of soaking it up, from an observational level and building up its experience database. And then when you go to sleep or you're just hanging out, doing whatever, you start building up these connections between concepts, between events, between facts and names and data that's in your Excel spreadsheet living in your head. And that's what NI is doing. And so a quote unquote NI user is a little different than like a TI user if they're dominant, right? Where TI is sort of actively doing things. Again, Jung called it a rational function. You are trying to come up with an answer to something. You are plugging something into an algorithm and trying to get some sort of output. So the thinking functions and the feeling functions are those active functions where you're doing something with the information. Your brain is, or whatever. Where SI, SE, NI, and NE are a little bit more passive. And I don't want to say they're 100% passive. I do think that there is some activity that we're doing that is sort of shaping things, so to speak. But when we say you're a dominant NI user, I think it's more about it's easier for you to, number one, it's probably easier for you to reach into that database and pull information out. Number two, for whatever reason, your brain is just doing that relational linking information, making analogies, just a little bit more than other people. And maybe it's because we sleep more. I don't know, or we're just lazy. But whatever it is, our brain is sort of doing it. And again, I think there's some activity to it. I think you can work that muscle by thinking of analogies and then just sort of getting in the habit of doing analogies. But I really think it's more of just ease of use. So, for example, when Eric does the NI testing, and he'll give you like a series of words, and you have to figure out like, okay, how are they connected? For an NI user, it's just easier to tap into that. It's just easier to pull out like, okay, here's sort of the underlying meaning that connects these concepts. Why is it easier to dip into? I don't know. The argument would be, it's just sort of your natural, whatever brain system that is sort of your default system. And so you don't have to exert a whole lot of energy to do it. Where somebody who, NI is a little lower on the stack, they sort of have to shut down all the other functions and then bring that one up. And so it's a little harder, takes more time, takes more effort, attention to do it. So, anywho, but and so I would invite the viewer who left this comment, when you're thinking about NI and TI and what TI is really doing. I mean, TI to me is a little bit more in the here and now. It's not doing things so much long term as it is doing things like socionics likes to describe TI as building structures, building knowledge structures. I don't agree with that. I think that's what NI is doing, and SI to some extent, is building up the knowledge base. TI is like actively doing a process, and that is, and the process is not building up the structure. The process is validation, trying to come up with, is this a correct answer or is this a not correct answer, given the premises. And it sounds real simple when you look at just very simple, logic 101 formulas. If P, then Q, not Q, then not P. That sounds very simple, but any sort of computer programmer or formal logician will tell you that gets complicated exponentially quickly, right? As you start adding rules on top of rules, so thinking is a very complex, introverted thinking is a very complex system, but it is active. It's what you're doing to come up with an answer to something. Not so much as building things. I mean, your NI is sort of reading and hovering over your TI and seeing, oh, okay, yeah, TI came up with this conclusion. Here's a new little tidbit for my database, right? And SI could be doing the same thing. Here's a new little tidbit for my SI database. So in that respect, TI is sort of building up the structure, but I don't think it's doing it. It's not just TI doing it. So, okay, probably lingered long enough on all this stuff, but hopefully, it's interesting. It raised a lot of interesting questions, and this is all stuff that I probably said before, but framing it maybe in a different way. So those of you who are playing along at home can see what I'm thinking. So, all right, cool. Talk to everybody later. Hope you have a good night. Bye.